Hello students, so today I am going to start a new chapter which is chapter number 5 in your book, and the name of the chapter is Constructors and Destructors. In this presentation I shall be discussing about the topics called rules for constructor, default constructor and constructors with default arguments. Now first try to understand what is a constructor. Now read the first point. It says constructors are declared as member functions with the same name as the class. Now if you look at this class identified by the name employee, this has got two member functions. The first one is employee and the second one is display. Now out of these, one of these member function is a constructor. Can you guess which one? If you look at this first member function, its name is same as that of the class. So this is the constructor. But if you look at the second member function, its name is display, which is not the same as that of the class because the name of the class is employee. So this is an ordinary member function. Okay, this is an ordinary member function, whereas this member function is a constructor because its name is identical as that of the class. So constructors are declared as member functions which should have the same name as that of the class. Now read the second and the third point. The second point says they are invoked automatically when the object of a given class is created. That means the constructors are called automatically when the object of the class is created. Now if you look at this sample program, as soon as you create an object identified by the name EMP out of the class named employee, automatically this constructor shall be called or invoked, and then this constructor shall initialize the data members of the class. Now for this particular class identified by the name employee, having EMP code, EMP name, EMP desig and EMP salary as the data members, the constructor initializes the data member EMP code with the value 100, and then it again initializes the data member EMP name with the value Sujata. It initializes the data member EMP desig with the value PGT computer, and then it initializes the data member EMP salary with the value 12,500. And just after the constructor gets called automatically when the object of a given class is created, the constructors then initializes the data members of the class. Now initialize here means assigning certain values to the data member of the class. Like I have assigned these initial values to these data members of the class, and this shall be done inside the constructor named employee. So constructors are often used to initialize the data members of a class. Now read the fourth point. It says constructors are generally declared in the public section. Now if you look over here, I have declared the constructor for this class named employee under this public section. This is because as soon as I create an object named EMP out of this class called employee, the compiler is going to automatically invoke this constructor or call this constructor, and this was made possible only because I have declared this constructor under the public access specifier. But if I make this access specifier as private, okay, if I make this access specifier as private, then in this case, even if I create this object EMP out of this class employee, this constructor cannot be invoked or called by the compiler, as private members are not accessible outside of the class. So in this case the program cannot run. This is because even if the object has been created, the compiler is unable to invoke this constructor as it has been declared as private. So there is no use creating objects like this, because if we are unable to invoke or call this constructor, we can't initialize the data members of the class with these values. As a result, this entire class becomes useless. So the best practice is to keep the access specifier for the constructor as public. So let me make it public now. Now once the access specifier for the constructor is public, as soon as I create the object out of this class, the compiler can automatically invoke this constructor as it has been declared as public. Now once this constructor gets invoked by the compiler, then its body part, which has been declared outside of the class using the scope resolution operator, does the initialization by assigning initial values to the data members EMP code as 100, EMP name as Sujata, EMP desig as PGT computer, and EMP salary as 12,500. And that's the reason the constructors are generally declared in the public section. Then read this fifth point. It says constructors may also have arguments. Now what do you mean by arguments? Arguments are the parameters. Now if you declare a function having some parameters, then those parameters are also referred to by the name arguments. In the same way, if we have constructors that have parameters, then those parameters inside the constructors are also referred to by the name arguments. Now if you look at this constructor, it doesn't contain any parameters, or we can say it doesn't contain any arguments. So it is a parameterless constructor or an argumentless constructor. But if you put parameters such as eCode, ename, EMP desig, and eSalary inside your constructor, this becomes a parameterized constructor. And this shows that a constructor can have parameters or arguments. Now let me put it how it was before. Before it was like this. The constructor employee had no parameters or no arguments. Now what do we call such constructors which do not have any parameters or arguments? We call such constructors as default constructor. As this has been clearly stated here, the default constructor is the one that either has no parameters, as it is in this case where this constructor employee has no parameters, or if it has a parameter list, then all the parameters should use default arguments. Now this is important. This is the second criteria for a constructor to become a default constructor. Okay, the second criteria says that in order to become a default constructor, if the constructor has some parameters, then all those parameters must have default arguments. Now if you look at this class identified by the name employee, this class has got 3 member functions. Out of these 3 member functions, 2 are constructors. These 2 are the constructors, as their name resembles the name of the class, which is employee. Now if you look at both these constructors, they contain parameters. Their parameters are eCode and eSalary. Let's come to the first constructor. It contains parameters eCode and eSalary. The parameter eCode has been assigned the default value as 110, and the parameter eSalary has been assigned a default value of 17,000. So this is a constructor with default arguments. Now in this case, since all the parameters eCode and eSalary has been assigned default values such as 110 for eCode and 17,000 for eSalary, so this is also known as a default constructor in addition to being called as constructor with default arguments. This is because, as stated here, the default constructor is the one that either has no parameters, which is the first criteria, or it has a parameter list in which all the parameters use default arguments, which is the second criteria. Now here the first criteria is not fulfilled because this constructor employee has parameters. But again, all its parameters are assigned default initial values such as 110 for eCode and 17,000 for eSalary. So the second criteria has been satisfied as all the parameters use default arguments. And that's why this constructor employee is also a default constructor in spite of having parameters. But if you look at this constructor, only one parameter out of eCode and eSalary has been assigned an default value. Okay, here only one parameter, that is eSalary, has been assigned the default value, which is 18,000. That is why this is not a default constructor, as all its parameters are not assigned initial default values. Here the parameter eCode has not been assigned any initial default value. So for such reason we can call this constructor as a constructor with default arguments. We can't consider this constructor as a default constructor. Next, read this particular point. It says a class can have any number of constructors including none. Now none means zero constructors. That means inside a class you can have any number of constructors starting from 0, 1 till infinity. So there is no limit to the number of constructors that you can create inside a class. In fact, you can create unlimited number of constructors inside a class. If you want to create 10 constructors inside a class, you can create. If you want to create 20 constructors, you can create. Even if you want to create 1,000 constructors inside a class, you can do so. But if you do not put any constructor inside a class, then the compiler will automatically create a constructor for that class. Now if you look at this sample program, we have a constructor identified by the name employee, and it has been declared under the public section. Now let's say I don't want to put any constructor for this class employee. So for that reason I am going to delete this constructor. Now see, I have deleted the constructor, and the class employee now doesn't contain any constructor. So what's going to happen now is that even if I haven't put any constructor inside this class known as employee, the compiler is automatically going to create a constructor for this class. As soon as you have created an object EMP out of the class employee, since there is no constructor defined for this class employee in the public section, so the compiler then automatically invokes the default constructor employee with no initialization. That means in the absence of a constructor for this class employee, the constructor automatically invokes a default constructor by the name employee, which do not take any parameter, and that is done implicitly by the compiler. So that's what has been stated here. A class can have any number of constructors, but if it doesn't have any constructor, that is if the constructor is none, then in that case the compiler automatically creates a constructor for that class. And then when an object of a class gets created, then in that case the default constructor gets invoked that has been created by the compiler. Now note one thing, that the default constructor that shall be created by the compiler will have no parameters. So keep in mind that the default constructor which will be created by the compiler shall have no parameters. That's why for this class named employee, since the constructor name should also be employee, it must not contain any parameters if it has to be automatically invoked or called by the compiler. Now look at this point. It says you must not include any return type, not even void, for constructors. Now look at this constructor of this class known as employee. If you see this constructor, there is no return type, not even void. But if you look at this member function display, this has got the return type void. And that is the difference between a constructor and a member function. Constructors belonging to a class doesn't have any return type as indicated here in this constructor named employee. But the member functions for a class can have a return type. If you see here, the member function display contains the return type void. So you must not include any return type, not even void, for constructors. Then look at this point. It says if you do not declare any constructors in a class definition, the compiler assumes the class to have a default constructor with no arguments. Now in this case, for this class named employee, you already have a default constructor, okay, which has no parameters, and that has been declared under the public section. Now if I remove this default constructor, now when the constructor has been removed out of this class named employee, then in that case the compiler shall automatically invoke the default constructor employee, which I have already explained. Now let me explain this sample program to you. This program has been taken from the book. If you want to refer to this program in your book, you have to go to page number 1.144. This program consists of a class identified by the name employee. These are the data members of the class employee which have been declared as private. These are the member functions which are declared under the public access specifier section. Out of these two member functions, the member function employee is a default constructor because its name is identical as the name of the class, which is also employee. And then again, it consists of no parameters, okay. This constructor doesn't contain any parameters, and as the rule states that when a constructor has no parameters, it has to be a default constructor. So in this case, employee here is a default constructor. The body of this default constructor has been defined outside of this class using the scope resolution operator. As the constructor doesn't have any return type, so I don't have to put any return type over here, okay. So without any return type, I directly point to the class specified by the name employee, okay, and just after I put the name of the class, I specify the scope resolution operator as denoted by this double colon, and then I specify the name of the constructor like this, employee, and then this function symbol. After that, the body part of this constructor initializes the data members of the class, which are emp code, emp name, emp desig, and emp salary. It initializes the data member emp code with the value 100, emp name with the value Sujata, emp desig with the value PGT computer, and emp salary with the value 12,500. Then here is the body part of the member function known as display. since the return type of the member function display is void, so I start with void. Okay, so I start with void here and then specify the name of the class, which is employee, followed by the scope resolution operator as denoted by this 2 double colon, and then I specify the name of the function, which is display. Then after that I declare the body region of this function, and these are the statements inside the body region. Now the program is always going to start from the main function, as the main is the inception of the program. Okay, then just as the control moves inside the body of this main function, it executes the first statement. Okay, this statement tries to create an object identified by the name emp out of the class employee. Now as soon as this object emp gets created out of this class employee, these data members and these member functions shall be wrapped around the object to form an encapsulation around the object emp. And once this is done, then in the next step the constructor of the class shall be called. The permission to access the constructor has been granted because the constructor has been declared under the public section. Now once the constructor has been invoked, the control moves over here and then it executes the body of the constructor, and after that it initializes the data members emp code with the value 100, emp name with the value Sujata, emp desig with PGT computer, and emp salary with the value 12,500. So that is the job of the constructor. It initializes the data members of a class. So always keep in mind that as soon as you create an object of a class, if the class has constructors, as in here, which is declared inside the public section, then this constructor shall be automatically invoked by the compiler, and after that the body part of the compiler gets executed, and it is here where the data members of the class gets initialized. So once this statement gets executed and the object emp gets created, the constructor shall be called automatically by the compiler, and then the initial values are assigned to the data members of the class. Then in the next statement it prints the text. Here is the employee information using this cout command, and this text gets displayed in the output like this. As the text ends with a /n, so the control is going to move to the next line over here. Then in the next line it starts a for loop, and with the help of this for loop it prints the equality operator 33 times, because if you count from I equal to 0 till I less than equal to 32, 0 to 32 means 33 times. So 33 times this equality operator is going to be printed in the output. And then in the next line, using the same object emp that was created, I am trying to access the member function display. Now as the member function display has been declared under the public section, so this is accessible. Now since its body part is defined outside of the class, so the control is going to jump over here. It then prints the text employee code in the output, followed by the value assigned to the data member emp code. Now as I have assigned the value 100 to the data member emp code during the initialization process of this constructor known as employee, so I get to see employee code 100 as the output. In the next statement it tries to print the text employee name followed by the value assigned to the data member emp name. During the initialization process, the value assigned to the data member emp name was MS Sujata. So employee name MS Sujata. Then in the next two lines we have employee designation and then the value assigned to the data member emp desig, and then the employee salary with the value assigned to the data member emp salary. Now during the initialization process of this constructor named employee, I have assigned the initial value of PGT computer to emp desig and 12,500 to emp salary. That's why I can see the value PGT computer for employee designation and 12,500 for employee salary. So this is the output that we get to see once I execute this program. And once the last statement gets executed inside the body of this member function display, then the control again comes to the position where it left and then moves to the next line. The program now ends with this closing parenthesis of the main function. Now that's the end of today's presentation. I shall continue the next topic tomorrow.